Thank you. My wife is laughing at me as well in the room because she reminded me right before I reminded myself. So thank you, Adam. Your reminder made it so we are now recording. All right, so your second exam opens tomorrow. Essentially, as soon as you wake up tomorrow, it'll be open to you, or you could stay up really late tonight and then take it right after midnight if you wanted to do that. And then it closes Saturday at 11:59 p.m. So you have any time within that 48-hour period that you can take it. I'm going to go and look at how many questions it is really quickly. Maybe I should pull this over here so I don't show the answers to the exam. If we get done early enough, maybe we'll go over some of the study guide, but chapter 11 is not really long, but there's a lot to talk about in chapter 11. So I would be surprised. So it does have a 90-minute time limit. It is open notes, open book, just like usual. Let me make sure I know how many questions it is so I can tell you. So 61 questions, and you'll have 90 minutes to complete it. So plenty of time, but not enough time to try and look up every answer, but you'll have plenty of time to be able to do the quiz or do the exam, and then look up a few of the answers that you're not sure on. So there you go. That opens tomorrow, and it is over chapters 8, developmental psych, 11, social psych, which we're going over today, and chapter 4, which started off unit 2. So, all right, any questions about the exam or the structure there, or additional questions about groups or anything like that before we jump into chapter 11? Either raise your hand using the app, or feel free to use the chat box as well. Good question, Adam. Nope. On exam 2, hopefully you remember the material from the first chapters, because questions that are relevant to like neurology, you'll need to remember that information, but there won't be questions specifically from the first chapters. But if you don't remember like what an experiment is, for example, then you might be confused on the question. But no, there won't be any questions from the first unit, from chapters 1, 2, and 3 are our first unit in this class, right? Yep, 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, the exam will only be over 4, 8, and 11. But hopefully you do remember those main components from the first unit, like types of research methods, what is a correlational study, because that might be part of a question, but not what the question is entirely about. When is the group project due? The group project is due at the very end of class, essentially. It is due, is this the right class that I'm showing? Yeah, this is the right class. Okay, so presentations are due December 9th. With that, do remember that everybody in your group needs to turn in both the final product, the slideshow with the notes, as well as a assessment of all other members of the group. And we'll go over that assessment as we get closer to the end. I did show it before in class, but we'll re-go over that before that. So, yep, December 9th. So most of your time working on that will need to be done out of class. Again, I don't think we have any more allotted time. Oh, looks like we've got one more day allotted next Thursday to work on it during class time. So that'll be the last class time we devote to it so that you can work in groups. So after that, everything will be done on your own time. Great question, though. All right, well, let's jump into chapter 11. So chapter 11 is on social psychology. Oh, and here I just put all the topics here. So to remind you, be working on the group project. These are the topics. Anybody who's not in a group, jump in a group ASAP. All right, so similar to developmental psych, a social psych is a very broad area of study. So the topics that social psych study touch on a lot of different things, because it's psychology is how people think, behave, those kinds of things from chapter 1 we talked about. And and think about thinking as well. So social psychology is specifically the scientific study of how people think about things, influence, and relate to other people. So this is like one-on-one interactions. This is an individual influencing a group. This is a group influencing an individual. This is a group influencing another group, and vice versa. And with that, those groups can get kind of larger and larger. So social psychology is really overlapping with sociology depending on the size of group that you're getting. If you're talking about the influence that one person has on one other person, that's social psychology there. But sociology doesn't overlap as much there. So, but the larger you're getting a group at, the more overlap with sociology, and as well as other fields of study. So developmental psych, you have to look at health, you have to look at a lot of different areas. You need to look at evolution. Very similar with social psychology. It covers a lot of areas of human life. Right now, we're in a social environment. Even though we're speaking through screens and chatting online, this is still, there's social interactions, right? Social media is obviously social. So social media falls under social psychology as well. So there's a lot of things that can fall under social psych. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from the history of social psychology, but hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about what social psychology is doing today. But some of those basic core pieces have kind of just been dove into in more depth. Similar to developmental psychology, we started with a focus on children, and then we kind of are going really deep into how children develop, all those kind of intricacies, but we've also expanded all the way through the lifespan. Social psych has done kind of that same thing. These basic topics that will start out from the beginning are just now being, well, not just now as in they haven't been researched before. Now they are still researching some of those same topics, just diving into them in more depth, as well as a more transdisciplinary study of the field. So sociology specifically focuses on group level behaviors and processes. So that's where it overlaps with social psych. Social psych, especially in the early days, focused on the individual, so one single person, and how a group was affecting them, and how that one person might be affecting a group, or how one person might be affecting another person. So a lot of the history that we're talking about today and past research is talking about that individual being affected by a group or one other individual. All right, so person perception is one of the key components of social psychology and one of the first areas that was studied in social psychology. And that's essentially, in layman's terms, how we form impressions of other people. So if you take a look at both of these pictures of both of these people, it's the same person, probably an actor. I don't actually know though. So the same actor in both of these pictures. So you might form a certain impression of this person that's different than what you're forming of this person. You might assume this person rides a motorcycle, and you might assume that this person goes to work in a hospital. So that might be a perception that you make. You might assume that this person might be more trustworthy than this person, but they're the same people. Maybe, I mean, obviously it's an actor in just two different sets of clothes, but your initial impression is what we're talking about here. Person perception. So with that, the prefrontal cortex, so that upper part of your brain up here, is really important for doing that. So calling back to previous memories, things that you know about people in general, interpreting observations that you're making of this person. Like you might say, oh, he's got full sleeve tattoos. So that might go into your initial perception of this person. So the face is also very important. So the facial expression here is pretty similar in both of them. The lighting's obviously very different though. With that, these impressions are happening really quickly. So the first time we meet someone, this person perception is essentially that initial first impression. So that initial couple moments of seeing that person and kind of making a judgment. And the reason we do this, and we have evolved the capacity to make these kind of perceptions, is because it can be really useful in social situations. You go to a store, it's really useful to be able to quickly form impressions of, say, the workers in an aisle. Maybe one looks like they're more tired, one looks like they're more alert. So you might ask the one that's more alert or maybe looks more cheerful where something is, right? So it can help you in social situations. And they're surprisingly accurate, but they're definitely not perfect. And we'll talk about how errors at that first point of our first person perceptions can lead to basically a cascade of problems as we go. So these are sometimes difficult for people to talk about because sometimes they're related to maybe things like racism or also improper perceptions that we have of certain people or groups. So you don't have to share things like that, but is there any examples of times that your initial impressions were correct or incorrect? So as an example, you might meet someone and they have a shirt of a band on or something like that. And your initial impression was, oh, well, they're probably similar to me or very dissimilar to me. And then you either learned that you were correct or incorrect. So any kind of examples of that stick out in your mind of a time when that really initial, like I see this person, I form an impression, and then I start getting to know them and find out that I was wrong or right. Any examples of that? Feel free to use the chat box or raise your hand and then use your mic. Either way works fine. All right, go for it, Jonathan. Thank you.
All right, so I have more of like the other way around. People often like get an impression on me because I have tattoos on my hands, but then they ask what they mean. I guess I should ask if you could hear me, right? Okay, cool. So yeah, but then they ask me what they mean, and it's like peace, harmony, tranquility, loyalty, stuff like that, and then they're just like, oh, and then they get kind of awkward. But I guess that could be an example.
No, that's a really great example because they're forming this initial impression, and it's probably that maybe you're more gruff or rough or maybe mean or something like that because of your tattoos. And then they find out what they mean. And so that kind of pause, we'll talk about this later, is probably cognitive dissonance. So they had this perception of you, and then all of a sudden they learn, oh, well, my initial impression and attitude was one way, but the truth is actually this way. So they've got to, in that moment, essentially figure out, well, how do I combine these things? Do I throw away my previous perception and have this brand new perception? Do I combine them in some way? That kind of thing. So that's essentially what we'll be talking about for a lot of these examples today. Adam says as well, going with what you said about seeing someone in a band shirt, I assume they listen to the band. And if I find out they don't listen to them, it changes your perception of them. Yeah, that's a good example. And you have this initial impression. Maybe there's someone that you like or don't like, or that you might get along with, or that they have a certain set of interests that you know from previous experience. So again, calling to memories, like I had a friend who liked Incubus, for example, and he also liked these things, and he always wore Incubus shirts. As an example, there was a lot of kids in my high school that wore Incubus shirts but didn't actually listen to the band. I always thought that was strange, but yeah, it did then change my perception of them. So a really good example, Adam. All right, so with that, these can then lead to and build up stereotypes. And additionally, stereotypes can reinforce and essentially create a pool of ideas or memories to pull from when we make these person perceptions. So these person perceptions may be heavily influenced by stereotypes, especially if we've never encountered a person that's like what we're interacting with. And all we know and all we can call back from is some stereotype. So stereotype in social psychology is defined as a generalization about a group. So you might have a generalization about people from France. You might have a generalization, or maybe even just Paris specifically. Maybe you have a generalization about people from UK, or maybe London specifically. So you have a stereotype, that generalization about that group as a whole. So with this, the reason we do this is because we do have limited cognitive capacity. And so one way we deal with that is by putting people into categories. We've talked about personality psychology a little bit. So we put people in these personality bubbles to kind of make sense of them. So even researchers do this, right? So, and just based on our experience with people, we like to kind of put people in bubbles. It makes it easier to interact, especially when the interaction is really brief. So like at a store or someone you're not really going to see before. Even if you're incorrect in your person perception, or even if you're using a stereotype, that interaction might go smoothly enough that it still works well enough to get you through the days. So that's essentially why these features of cognition developed. So it can be a really useful tool, but stereotypes can be incredibly incorrect and can lead to harm and other things that we'll talk about. So one of those things is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So our perceptions based on maybe stereotypes can cause us to interact with people in ways that cause them to act in the way we expect. So one example of this is if you tell a teacher with a new group of students, let's say they have 20 students in their classroom. If you say, hey, these 10, so the principal, some administrator, the previous teacher from the class, you say, hey, these 10 students on this side of the classroom, they are late bloomers. And then you tell them, okay, these others on the other side of the classroom, they're general students. What you'll see is that based on that perception now, the teacher will, in fact, give more time and more attention to the students who are late bloomers, even though they might have just been selected at random, or maybe just based on where they chose to sit in the room. And based on that, it will then lead to the students gaining a little more knowledge, doing better a little quicker on average. And so that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because of that perception, now the group has acted differently because of that. Same thing if you say, hey, this student is a difficult student, or this student is an easy student. So if both of the difficult student and the easy student show the same behavior, they might get different interactions from the teacher. So self-fulfilling prophecy works in that way. And I do want to point out, this is really similar to those models of bidirectional interaction in developmental theory. I'll actually pull up one of those models since we looked at it so many times during our discussion on Tuesday. I thought I would have had it here sooner. Maybe this was a bad idea. I'm going to get lost trying to find it. Never mind. So like Lerner's model, where the child had a bidirectional arrow with the parent. The child interacts with the parent, changes how the parent interacts with the child, then changes how the child then interacts with the parent. So this could be a really upward spiral if you think the students are late bloomers, or it could be a really downward spiral if you have a perception that a student is a difficult student. So our perceptions will change the way we behave in different ways. So another problem with these stereotypes and these perceptions is stereotype threat. So this one's a little different in that the person knows that there's a stereotype about their group, and they will then change their behavior and usually be anxious in situations relevant to that stereotype. So sexual minority groups, there's stereotypes about them, and maybe they will be anxious in any relevant situation based on the stereotypes that they're aware of. There's a variety of races and ethnic minorities that have various stereotypes about them. The elderly, women and girls, low SES people. So let's say someone who is low SES knows that people think, oh, well, people who are using food stamps are bad or lazy. So the stereotype, there's a generalization about that group, right? So with that, they might not want to, they might feel really anxious to engage in political discussions if they know that they are using food stamps, right? They might feel really anxious. So that's one example. Individuals with disabilities often have stereotypes, and addicts in recovery as well. There's a lot of stereotypes. So any of these groups or any of the stereotypes relevant to them could lead to stereotype threat, them feeling anxious in situations relevant to the stereotypes that exist. So this was really clear. There was once an interview I was watching of an Asian American actor. It was something like a Fast and the Furious movie, but it's the first time that they had ever driven on camera, essentially, with this new group of people, with a new crew, those kinds of things. And they knew there was a stereotype that they might be a bad driver. So they felt really, as they got into the car and started filming their scenes, they really wanted to do well to prove the stereotype wrong. So that was one example of how stereotype threat, so the ideas of different groups, of grouping Asian Americans in a group saying they're bad drivers, again, stereotypes, this generalization about that group, leading to this actor being really anxious and behaving differently in that scenario, making it a lot more difficult for them to go through that scenario. So that's what stereotype threat is. Hopefully you read in the book, we didn't get a chance to talk about this during lecture, but schemas are essentially a set of ideas that we kind of pull from and use in similar to, no, I won't go there. I was going to say, well, I guess I'll kind of say it. So similar in some ways to how scientists use theories as this whole set of ideas that are kind of explained under a theory. In some ways, schemas are kind of like that. They're like mini theories that we use to explain how people behave and things like that. So stereotype threat happens in a similar way. We have this schema. Stereotypes part of that schema, changes how we interact with people, how we behave. If it's a relevant stereotype to us, we might be anxious, or we might try to fight against that stereotype and prove we're not that way, and basically behaving differently because of the attitudes of groups. All right, so another big area of social psychology, we have perception, stereotype, attribution theory. Attribution theory is another big one that was being investigated early on, but is now still being investigated, just like diving into more depth and how it's relevant to other things now. So as you learn a lot about something, then you can go deeper and you can connect it to other things, so you can go broader. And so that's essentially what the research today is doing. So feel free to raise your hands or put questions in the chat as we go through these. I think so far these concepts are probably pretty familiar, especially if you read the chapter already. But if you have questions, definitely let me know. So attribution theory is the idea that people are motivated to discover the causes of other people's behavior and make sense of it. So this is just kind of a silly comic asking, why is he doing that? So he's trying to figure out why someone is doing something. And then this character, I don't actually know what this show is, but I thought it was a funny comic. So he's attributing a lot of this character's behavior to his statement that he loves everything, and it makes you do stupid things. So we try to make sense of people's behavior. So when we see someone helping someone on the side of the street or not helping someone, we try to understand the cause. Why did they do that? Why did they help? Why did they not help? We see someone looking up at the sky. We might try to attribute that to something. Well, why are they looking up at the sky? We try to make sense of it. And so we generally think people have internal versus external causes to their behavior. Maybe their behavior is caused by stable or unstable characteristics, and we'll go into detail on these. And maybe they're controllable and uncontrollable causes. So let's start with internal and external causes. So an internal cause of a behavior might be like a trait or ability. So that person is helping the person on the side of the street because they are a really empathetic person. They're a really loving person. They're a really caring person. They have a trait that then causes them to do this behavior. External is things outside the person, situational factors. So let's say if you did really well on the test, you might say, well, it was because the test was really easy. That's putting it on something external. So, right? And we usually do this. We usually put it either on internal or external. So if you all get a really high score on the test, you might all say, well, it was easy. But maybe it's because you're all just really good at learning the concepts of psychology. So something more internal, right? So stable versus unstable characteristic. Stable are things that are not changing. So personality traits are supposed to not change. They're supposed to stay pretty consistent across different contexts. In reality, they don't, and we'll talk about that more in our chapter that focuses all on personality. But they don't actually stay the same. But that's what stable versus unstable is about. So is this because of something that doesn't change? Like that person is just a helpful person. That's why they're helping the person on the side of the road. An unstable characteristic is quickly changing. So, for example, in the afternoon, sometimes my son and daughter get grumpy. So as they get grumpy, actually, that reminds me, I need to check if my son is still asleep upstairs. So with that, if he does a nap, he tends to be happier in the afternoon. If he doesn't nap, he tends to be a little more grumpy in the afternoon. My daughter similarly has an unstable characteristic of if she doesn't snack every like hour and a half, she gets really grumpy. It's kind of like those Snickers commercials. Like give her some food and then she's a lot more cheerful. So with that, it's an unstable characteristic. Well, why is she being mean to her brother? Oh, well, she hasn't eaten in 2 hours. So give her some food, and now I can attribute the behavior to something different, or I can attribute that mean behavior to that unstable characteristic, versus I don't think she's a mean kid, right? So it's not a stable characteristic. I'm attributing that to an unstable characteristic. So controllable and uncontrollable causes, there are things that we assume, we might be wrong, but that we assume people can control. So you might assume that people can control their emotions, can control something like they can make their dinner, or they can do something about some problem. There's other things that we can't control. So is it rainy? Is it cold? So the other day I was taking a walk, and I probably shouldn't use so many negative examples from my kids, but my daughter was getting kind of grumpy during the walk. And so we said, hey, what's going on? Do you need some food? Was one of the first ones we went to. But it was that she was getting really, really cold. So she let us know that it was raining. It was getting cold. And so we're like, well, there are things you can do to control this. You can put on some more clothes. So we attributed that behavior to that thing that she can't control, the cold. And then we said, hey, you can control the behavior of putting on clothes. So some different examples there of controllable versus uncontrollable causes. Some person's behavior might be from something completely outside of themselves, outside of their control entirely. So, and these can kind of mix as well. These are like the internal, external, those don't mix, but you can have an internal trait that's also stable, as an example. So we as people, when we see people doing behaviors, we try to attribute that behavior to some cause. Why is that person doing this? Why is that person acting whatever way? So we often make errors about why people do things, though. So we try to attribute, but we often make errors here. So usually we think a cause is internal rather than environmental. So just on average, if we see some behavior, we tend to, on average, go to an internal cause. So why did that person help the person on the side of the road? Oh, because they're a helpful person. We'll go to that internal cause rather than something environmental. So environmental being like they're cold. So my daughter was cold instead of she's a grumpy kid. So the internal cause would be like she's a grumpy kid. That's just who she is versus environmental is she's cold. So this is called the fundamental attribution error because it happens so often. That's the name of it. The fundamental attribution error is when we assume something is coming from inside someone, their internal characteristics, rather than something outside themselves. So the situation making them act a certain way, basically. So we also make a fundamental attribution error of ourselves, and it's called self-serving bias. So if we assume other people are behaving in a way that is internal, what might that say about our assumptions of our own behavior, our attributing our own behavior? Are we attributing most of our own behavior to internal or external causes, do you think? And then why? Maybe give an example. Or if you remember from the book, you can just say that as well. I don't think anyone's answering, and it is kind of a difficult question because there's two things that we do. We generally believe mistakes that we make are caused by outside forces, so are someone else's responsibility. So let's say we do poorly on exam 2. We might say something like, oh, Professor Riches just has it out for me. He made a really hard test. He wants everybody to fail. So that would be an external cause. So any mistakes, it's self-serving to say, hey, our mistakes, the things that the behaviors we did that didn't work out or were maybe wrong, we attribute that to some outside force, versus the things that we do that were positive, we tend to attribute that internally to say, hey, I did that thing, or I did well because I'm really good at this thing. So that's called a self-serving bias. We assume things that we made mistakes on are outside of our control, or things that we did well on are because of internal causes. And sometimes we might be right. I don't want everybody to fail. I tried to make the test about as difficult as the first one, really, with mostly reasonably difficult questions and a couple easy ones and a couple hard ones. So again, hopefully we have everybody, my goal is to have everybody score like 80, in between 80 and 100 is what I hope to see. So with that, attitudes is another big thing that social psychologists study. Oh, I think my Teams might have just froze. We are on is everybody hearing me? It looks like my Teams might have froze. How much did you not get?
So far, I've heard everything.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we'll talk about attitudes. So attitudes is one thing that goes into people's behavior. So attitudes are our opinions and beliefs about people, objects, ideas, how we feel about things in the world. So you might have an attitude towards the ideas talked about in relation to the presidential election, right? So you might have attitudes towards it. You might have attitudes towards the candidates of the recent election. You might have attitudes towards certain countries. So stronger attitudes generally are correlated with the higher likelihood to act on that attitude. So if we have a strong attitude of helping people is a good thing to do, so if that's a really strong attitude that we have, we will be more likely to do something to help people. Let's say give them money on the side of the road or something like that. Weaker attitudes will be less likely to act on that. We still might hold that same attitude, but if it's not as strong to us, we'll be less likely to act. If a person is more aware of their attitudes, they're going to be more likely to behave in accordance with those attitudes. So there are attitudes that we essentially kind of just absorb. I mean, kind of a lay person way to say it, but maybe as we grow up, we just hear the things that our parents said and we kind of follow along with, let's say, their political ideology. So we have this attitude, but we've never really given it much thought. We're not as aware of our own attitudes. So if you're more aware of your attitudes, if you take some time and think about, well, why do I think X, Y, and Z politically? Why do I lean this way or this way politically? If you're more aware of that, you're going to be more likely to behave in accordance with those attitudes. And then if you have a vested interest, you're also going to be more likely to act on it. So if you say have a disability or need a treatment that uses medical marijuana, so if that's something that is relevant to you, you will probably be more likely to vote on the passage of a medical marijuana bill, for example. So if you have a vested interest in a certain candidate winning, so it's really important to you personally, that's a little disconnected though, I would say. Let's use a better example. Since we just had the election, it goes so well with talking about attitudes. Now my mind is like one track stuck on that. So I don't, having a hard time coming up with things outside of like the election. This is what happens when it's close to election. So many of my examples tie into there. All right, so let's talk about attitudes in relation to the theory of planned behavior. So again, the attitudes are opinions, beliefs about lots of things. So as we just talked about, that leads to a higher likelihood or lower likelihood of behaving. So this is actually the theory of planned behavior. So attitudes are part of it, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. But let's talk about attitudes. So attitudes, there's things that make your attitude either more likely to behave or less likely. So if you have a stronger attitude or a vested interest, your intention to behave will also be stronger. So essentially a stronger attitude that you have a vested interest with, that makes this arrow, I guess you could say, thicker or stronger, and leads to a higher intention to behave, and then that's likely to lead to actual behavior. So subjective norms, these are essentially what we think the general norm is about whatever behavior it is. So whether the behavior is using medical marijuana, or if the behavior is helping people who are asking for change on the side of the street. So what is the subjective norm? You might find different things in different areas, right? In one country or one state, people might be more or less likely to give help to panhandlers, right? So based on your subjective norm, that will also influence your intention to behave. So if you have an attitude that you really shouldn't help the people on the side of the street, and the subjective norm is also, hey, you shouldn't help the people on the side of the street, your intention to do that, to actually help, is going to be low, right? So if both of these are working together, it's going to be very low intention to behave. If the subjective norm is, hey, you should help people on the side of the street, if you have an attitude that you think that's a good thing to do, then you will be more likely to do it, especially if the subjective norm is. So you could see also how these could kind of counteract each other. So if you have an attitude that helping people on the side of the street is a good thing to do, but the norm in your area or your family or with your friends, if the norm that you're pulling from says, no, you shouldn't do that, these can kind of counteract each other. So you could think of it as an equation, if you want to think about it that way. So maybe your attitude would give you +2 likelihood to intend to behave by helping someone on the side of the street. But if your subjective norm gives you a -2, then those kind of cancel each other out. So this is kind of how this model works together. You've got attitudes, subjective norms, and then perceived behavioral control. So perceived behavioral control is pretty easy. It's essentially, can you actually act? So you might have the attitude that you want to, the subjective norm might be you should act, but can you actually do something about it? If you can, then that gives you more pluses, right? You're going to be more likely to intend to behave. If you can't really do anything about it, you might be less likely to try and do anything about it. So if you feel like there's nothing that can be done, you don't have any control of your behavior, let's say this is a silly example maybe. Let's say your car is broken, your brakes need to be fixed. So you need to change your brake pads. So maybe your attitude is that, hey, I want to change my brakes. I think it's useful to do my own maintenance on my car. It'll keep my costs low, so on and so forth. The subjective norm, maybe everyone in your family fixes their own cars. Maybe it's something that's really common to do. So you've got this +2 and +2 towards the intention to fix your own brakes, but your perceived behavioral control might be based on, well, do I actually have the tools to do it? Do I have access to those? And if you don't, that can kind of cancel out both of these. So these all kind of work together in an equation, and you can literally write equations of people's behaviors to try and predict how likely they will or will not be to behave certain ways, called regression equations, but we won't go into that much detail. That's a lot of stats. This is not a stats class. So perceived behavioral control is, do you think you can actually do something in this situation? So going back to the car example, you might want to, it might be the norm to fix your own car, but if you don't actually have control over the situation, you might not any longer have that intention to behave that way. But let's say you do have the tools, you do have the know-how, you know how to replace your brake pads. Everybody in your family has always replaced their brake pads, and you have the attitude that it's a useful thing or a good thing to do. Your intention to behave that way will be very high. So hopefully you can see that as kind of an equation of how attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control work together or can kind of combine in different ways to lead to your intention to behave. So your intention to behave pro-socially, your intention to fix your brakes on your car, your intention to vote, your intention to vote for this candidate or your intention to vote for that candidate, those kinds of things. And then based on that attention or intention, your intention is very, very closely correlated with actually doing the behavior. You can see there's this dotted line here because some people might think that they have the control to do something, but if they actually don't have the control, they might think that they do, but if they don't, so yeah, I can definitely fix my car's brakes, but then you go and you find the 10mm wrench and socket are gone again, then nope, you can't do it anymore. So your behavior is now can be determined in the end by that perceived behavioral control as well. All right, so this is a more up-to-date, you can see 2019. This first model was, actually first they started with attitude and subjective norm, I think in the 70s. Don't quiz me on that. And then this more updated model is 2019. Essentially, you still have that attitude, subjective norm, perceived behavioral control, and now they changed it to actual behavioral control up here. So you can see the kind of update here. And then before, there's even precursors now in the current research to those attitudes. What are your beliefs about the behavior? So those are different a little bit than attitudes, and they can lead to attitudes, beliefs about the norm. So your whole family thinks fixing the car is a good thing. What do you think about their beliefs? Do you think they're weird? We have enough money, we can fix the car. We don't have to do it. It takes too much time. Like, what are your beliefs about that norm? And then control beliefs. Do you think it's good that you have the capacity to fix the car or not? So these beliefs lead to attitudes and norms and that perceived behavioral control. Those lead to intentions, and then that intention leads to behavior, but it can be moderated by the actual control you have over the behavior. Again, if you're missing your 10mm wrenches and sockets, you might not be able to fix your brake. Not like that's ever happened to any mechanic or home mechanic ever in the history of doing mechanics. I mean, hopefully at least like one student gets that. The 10mm wrench is like always gone. It just like disappears. It walks away on its own sometimes. All right. So with attitudes, we mentioned cognitive dissonance a little while ago. So cognitive dissonance is the discomfort or the mental pain and anguish or stress and anxiety caused by holding two inconsistent attitudes at the same time. So if you have two different inconsistent attitudes, thoughts, or beliefs at the same time, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. And so social psychologists look at this as essentially a motivating force. It can motivate a couple different kinds of behaviors. So again, the dissonance itself often manifests as like anxious feelings. You might want to ignore or avoid the dissonant ideas. So if you have a certain attitude towards, let's say, a political candidate, and you learn some behaviors that they've done that are opposite of what you thought, you might feel a little bit of dissonance. You'll be like, wait, is that true? Is what this new information true? Or how do I move forward with this? So let's watch this video, and it'll talk about a couple different ways that we deal with cognitive dissonance, and a couple more examples of cognitive dissonance as well that I think will be useful.
Chances are good that you've heard of something called cognitive dissonance. It's a term that's starting to get thrown around a lot these days. But you might not know that it has a really deep root in classic social psychology. In 1957, Leon Festinger wrote a book on the theory of cognitive dissonance and outlined a really detailed understanding of what cognitive dissonance is and how people deal with it. Let's start out by talking about what cognitive dissonance is. How would we define it? At the very basics, cognitive dissonance is about inconsistency. When we hold two thoughts that are inconsistent with one another, basically, that's dissonance. So let's take the example of someone who smokes cigarettes. Here's a person who might have two distinct thoughts, one of which is, I regularly smoke cigarettes. The other of which is the knowledge that smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Here are two thoughts that a person can be having at the same time, acknowledging both of these things as fact, but they would seem inconsistent with one another. If you know that smoking is bad, then logically you probably wouldn't be engaging in that activity yourself. And so this is a case of dissonance because there's inconsistency in your own thoughts. So what do people do when they experience cognitive dissonance? Well, there are a few ways in which Festinger said that you could resolve the inconsistency as a way of resolving the dissonance. First, you can change one of those thoughts. So in the case of the smoker who realizes that smoking is bad and also that he is a regular smoker, he might change one of those beliefs and go, smoking's not that bad. It's actually not unhealthy to smoke. That would be changing one of your cognitions, one of your thoughts, as a way of restoring consistency. Another thing you could do is change your behavior as a way to restore consistency. So in this case, the smoker might say, well, if I acknowledge that smoking is bad, then the way I can be consistent is to stop smoking. So changing one of the behaviors that's related to the inconsistency. Another thing people can do is to add new thoughts into the mix, thoughts that help rationalize the inconsistency. So someone might say, yes, smoking is bad. Yes, I smoke regularly. But also, I do a lot of other healthy behaviors. I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, and I exercise a lot. So I'm adding new thoughts as a way to reduce the problem of inconsistency. And finally, people can just trivialize the inconsistency completely. They can just say, you know what? Sure, smoking's bad, and I smoke, but I just don't care. And that's going to be it. That's not really as big of a deal as people say that it is. That would be another way of resolving dissonance.
And that's tobacco.
But why do people feel like they need to resolve anything at all? What's the big deal about dissonance? Well, some people say that dissonance just gets in the way of finding some sense of truth. In general, if we want to understand the world, then we want a clear, consistent picture of it. And anything that makes us feel inconsistency is something that's a problem, and we're motivated to restore consistency again. But most of the research in dissonance has looked at something a little bit different. And that idea is that it's physically uncomfortable to experience cognitive dissonance. There's actually some negative physical tension that you feel anytime you recognize two inconsistent thoughts or realize that you've done something through your behavior that contradicts your true attitudes and beliefs. And so lots of studies have shown that this is the case by hooking up different sensors to people or tricking them into thinking that some pill makes them feel uncomfortable when in fact just their inconsistent thoughts is what's doing it. All of this research you can find more about in my blog post on this topic, but suffice it to say that for the most part, when you feel cognitive dissonance, you're feeling actual physical discomfort. You're feeling inner discomfort as well. And anytime we feel bad, we want to feel better. And to feel better, we just find a way to be consistent again. That's the driving force behind cognitive dissonance. It's worth pointing out that there are a couple times when dissonance is especially likely to motivate this action to resolve the inconsistency. One of them is the perception that you had some choice over the inconsistency. So sometimes in cognitive dissonance studies, what they'll have people do is agree to write some essay arguing against their own beliefs. So if you don't believe that your school should raise tuition, if you agree to write an article saying that your school should increase tuition, then that would be a case of dissonance. However, it would only make you feel that dissonance and that motivation to resolve inconsistency if you felt like you had a choice over whether or not you wrote that essay. If you didn't have any choice, if someone literally says, you have to write an essay before we can let you leave, and it has to say tuition increase is good, well, then you didn't have any choice over it, and it's not really that big of a problem. It's when you realize that you did have a choice and you chose to do the thing that contradicts your own opinions that you have to then find some comfort within yourself by resolving an inconsistency. In this case, convincing yourself that you actually do like tuition increase. The other thing that has to be there, according to a bunch of research, is the perception of aversive consequences. In other words, you have to think that the inconsistency in your thoughts is going to play out poorly for some reason in the future. So let's say you did write that essay saying tuition increase is good. If you believe that a school administration is going to read that essay and then say, hey, students think this is a good thing to do, there's a negative consequence. There's a negative consequence of your inconsistent actions.
All right, so I think that last point is pretty understandable. So I think we'll stop it there and jump back. So again, that dissonance causes you that anxiety as well as, in many instances, a physical pain that you might experience as well. So with that, they talked about 4 different ways that we get rid of dissonance. One is adding a thought, trivializing one of the thoughts, changing behavior, and also changing attitudes. So those are the couple ways that we can make our attitudes, again, reconsistent. And so this is important because these attitudes are part of that theory of planned behavior. So as we look in social psychology at the theory of planned behavior, looking at any behaviors, helping someone on the side of the street, fixing your brakes, calling a friend, any kind of behavior, these attitudes are important to predicting that and are kind of a precursor to intending to behave. So if you have an attitude that it's important to call friends, but you have no perceived behavioral control, your phone broke, well, that kind of leads to, are you going to intend to call? Well, probably not. You can't actually do that, right? That would probably be more of the effect of it mediating, though, rather than leading to your intention. You still might have the intention, but the behavioral control stops you from, say, calling a friend. So when you have 2 different attitudes, so calling a friend is good, but also, I didn't think of a good alternative attitude that's going to lead to dissonance there. I think the examples that we had were better. I don't want to confuse the issue. But some other examples are that victims of domestic violence oftentimes experience cognitive dissonance before leaving that kind of relationship. So with that, they might say, oh, well, this person did this to me or hurt me, but they also have the attitude, this person really cares about me. And so those 2 basically distinct, dissonant ideas kind of fight against each other. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can change behavior, leave, but as we know, that's a difficult thing to do. Or you can change one of the attitudes. They don't very often do that. It's not that bad. I know people who have it worse, those kinds of things. So trivializing these other methods too. So if you've ever changed religious beliefs at all, you probably experienced cognitive dissonance as well through that process, because some of your original beliefs might be different than the beliefs you then hold, and so you've got to figure out, which way are you going to go? So you probably experienced dissonance with those at different points in that process. So there's a couple other examples. So when figuring out your identity, especially during development, we didn't get to talk about identity development much or at all in this class, actually, in last period. But essentially, one big part of identity development is seeing consistent parts of yourself in different situations. So if you are helpful at home, at school, but you're not helpful at work, maybe that's an inconsistency you see in your own identity. So you might not be able to say to yourself, oh, well, part of my identity is that I am a helpful person. So you might experience cognitive dissonance because of that contradiction that you see there. And to get rid of that dissonance, you could do one of those 4 things. You might change your behavior. You might change how you think about it. Well, you might attribute your behavior in that situation at work. Well, I'm not as helpful at work because it's just a job, or because my boss is mean, or things like that. So you will get rid of this cognitive dissonance in some way. And it might lead to a change of attitudes, and that's why it's important within this theory of planned behavior. So this is an example of a time when I would, in the in-person class, have a group present on social psych experiments. One of the fun parts of social psychology research is some of the original experiments. I think they point to a lot of things in human behavior and social behavior that are really interesting. So we'll come back from, it's a little earlier than I generally like to take a break, but I think it will be relevant right now to take a quick break and then come back and watch these videos and start talking about these experiments. So as we do that, though, put up any questions that you have, or in the chat box, of things that we've covered so far. Because next we're going to dive into some of these historical experiments, and then by the end of class we'll talk more about what social psych is doing now, because these are pretty historical. These are like 70s, 60s experiments. So, all right, let's have a break. Let's be back at 3:38, and then we'll go through some experiments. All right, we are back. So I wanted to share really quickly the cognitive dissonance I experienced during the break. So I went downstairs and I saw there was no faucet on the sink. And I was like, oh, goodness, because it was leaking today. So I have two competing attitudes here. One is I like to do a lot of the work on like my car and my house, a lot of the maintenance myself because it saves money. So saving money, doing the work myself, good. Second attitude, I hate doing plumbing because it always gets screwed up. I always get wet and messy and it's not fun. So those are my two attitudes. So as I walked into the bathroom and I realized I hadn't finished that project because I had to go to the store and get some parts. So I walked in the bathroom and I had those two competing attitudes. I felt that cognitive dissonance saying on the one hand, hey, I should do the plumbing work, and on the other hand saying, no, don't do the plumbing work because it's gross and annoying. And so how I'm getting rid of this cognitive dissonance is that after class, I will just do it. I will change my behavior and I'll just do the plumbing job. So just a funny additional example of cognitive dissonance. So let's talk now about some social psych experiments, what they mean, how they're relevant even today. So we'll talk about the Asch conformity study first. It's about conformity.
Is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking
Maybe we'll watch it.
which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves...
I tried to load it up during the break so that this wouldn't happen. So sorry about that. It's freezing anyway on us.
A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. That's 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3. 3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. 1. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
So we'll talk about that more in detail in a minute. But the Asch study really goes to show that people will often conform to a group. So that impact of the group on that one individual. So it's clearly the other line, so line number 2 in a lot of those pictures. But the participant in the study would change their idea. You could pretty much see that kind of those attitudes in there and that dissonance, that feeling of being uncomfortable. And then what did they do? They changed their behavior to go along with what the group was doing. So this is relevant not just to picking a line on a thing, but also I can remember times in high school where all my friends were in the car with me, and either I was the driver or not the driver, and saying, hey, go faster, like see how fast your car can go. And so, well, you could conform to the group or not, right? Or do something totally different too. So there were times when you'd feel that pressure, maybe you'd conform to the group, or where you'd try not to conform to the group. So it's a powerful situation. The Milgram study is another really interesting one. And so we'll watch a short video on that, and then we'll talk about them in more detail. And then we'll talk about, we won't watch a video on the Stanford Prison study, but we'll talk about it. All right, so the Milgram study of obedience studied obedience. I wish my computer would be obedient and click the thing that I told it to click on. Maybe we won't watch the Milgram study on obedience. Oh, here we go. Maybe it'll work. It's just going super slow. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully, as it's outputting the video and you're downloading it on your end, the videos are, I mean, these ones are kind of older videos, so they're taken at a lower quality anyway, but hopefully you're getting the point of them. All right, well, maybe once it starts playing, we'll jump back to it. It'll probably just start playing on its own at some point. So with that, the conformity study, this line study, showed that people will oftentimes change their behavior to coincide with the behavior of the group. So why do we do this as humans? Why do we change our behavior to the same behavior that the group is doing? Well, as throughout our past, our evolutionary past, it's been very helpful for humans to work together and pre-human humans as well, to work together as groups, to do things together. So there's part of our ingrained genetic sense to be part of a group. And that can help a lot of times. So it increases group cohesion. It's often positive. So here we see looks similar to, say, a DMV, but rather than standing there in line together, these people have put their shoes out in place. And so this is the new group norm there. The group norm is not standing in line. It's putting your shoes out, and it allows everybody to sit down. And it's a lot more relaxed of a setting. So in this way, conforming with this group is probably going to be pretty positive. And many times in our evolutionary past, conforming to a group, working with a group, is adaptive to us individually as well as us as a human species. So with that, traffic rules and laws are another example. So when you follow those laws, you tend not to get in accidents, right? So it's a little less likely that you will. So if your friends start singing a song, you might join in, right? So wanting to be part of that group is built into us evolutionarily. So we will tend to conform, but it can be really negative. So that peer pressure to drive your car and max it out as fast as it can is probably not a great idea when you have a poorly maintained old Honda Civic, right? I mean, Honda Civic might be better than other cars that you could do that in. But if it's poorly maintained, probably a bad idea. So the group can also be wrong. So what if these lines here are going to the wrong window? So, and you don't know that because you didn't go up and check at the window. You just followed along with the group. Holiday shopping, you might experience this. You might get into a line thinking that you're going to the checkout, and in reality, you're in a line for something else. So Adam has a question. I need to put in my earpiece really quickly, though, so it doesn't reverb to everybody. So go for it, Adam.
Just going back to the last group presentation we had, my whole group, they all decided that the baby was securely attached, and I actually almost went with them. but I already had thought that it was insecure avoidant. I decided not to agree with them, but I almost did just to conform to the group, basically.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of that. I could kind of see that happening in your chat with your group as well. Oh my goodness, I'm talking here about traffic laws, and I literally almost just saw a car accident in front of my house. Sorry for that distraction. You couldn't hear the squealing tires and cars going. So yeah, but perfect example, Adam. So when you had that idea that it was insecure avoidant attachment, and then the rest of your group was saying secure, what were some of the feelings that you were feeling as they were trying to give their evidence for that?
Maybe I saw something that, well, maybe they saw something that I didn't see. Maybe like I just like missed something and they were right, because all like I think three of them agreed, but I like eventually I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna go with what I thought it was as I uh was thinking and observing.
It's really interesting that you made those specific comments, because in the actual paper for the ASH experiment, those were some of the most common things that the participants would say. They would say, oh, maybe the other participants who were actually actors, maybe they saw something I didn't. Maybe I misunderstood the instructions. So it's really interesting that you are thinking that same thing. It's decades after that original experiment, but still relevant to your behavior just the other day. So really good example.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing it. So in that case, it's an example of, I mean, in this case, it's just a classroom activity. So was it secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant? So it wasn't very high stakes, right? But if the group is wrong about something else that's more important, that could be really dramatic, right? Maybe a group thinks the water in a city is safe or something like that, and it really isn't. So conforming with that group could be bad, or conforming to drive your poorly maintained Honda Civic 115 miles an hour down the highway. That could be bad, right? That's probably the wrong decision. So why do we do these things? Well, other people can be a source of information. They're an informational social influence and also a normative social influence. So for informational social influence, this is one thing Adam just mentioned. The group might actually know something that you don't. They might have picked up on some piece of evidence there. They might have read another article that you didn't read, or seen something that you didn't see. So the group might actually be right. They might know something that you don't. Also, we want to be right. So if the group is right, we might want to go along with that group. So if you see a bunch of stopped or slowing cars, you'll probably slow down too. So oftentimes they're slowing down because there's like a cop on the side of the road or something like that. But if you come out of a classroom or out of a store and you see a bunch of people like this staring at the sky, what are you going to do? Probably look up, right? You'll probably look up to see, hey, do these people know there's about something that I don't? Is the moon coming crashing down? Is there a meteor? Is there spaceships in the sky, right? So you might want to see and conform to the group by looking up into the sky. Can you think of any other examples of times that you might conform because of the information? The group might know something that you don't. Adams was a great example of this. But can you think of other examples of when you might conform with a group? They can be right or wrong, but you're conforming because you think they might know something that you don't. Well, hopefully there's some ideas coming into the chat, but I'll keep moving on and then come back to it if these chats appear. So we also conform because groups can be a normative social influence. We want people, the video mentioned this, we want people to like us. We don't want to seem weird or out of place. We might start using the same kind of slang terms that a group is around us. We might wear similar clothes or even adopt the attitudes of that group. Through that process, we might experience some cognitive dissonance. But as we conform, we might work through that dissonance in a variety of those ways that we talked about. So the whole movie Mean Girls is a really good, fictional example, but it has a lot of really good examples of conformity based on normative social influence. Lindsay Lohan's character, I don't remember her name, her character's name, but she wanted at first she wanted to get in with the group I forget what the original intention was, but she started to conform and adopt their attitudes, use the same slang, become one of the plastics. So it's a really good example of that. And we want that for us too. We want to be part of the group. And so we might conform because of that. So think of examples in your own life when maybe you conform because of those things. And that can be useful, right? It can also lead to negative behaviors. Like in this movie, it led to a lot of negative behaviors. But if it was a more positive group that you're conforming to those and their behaviors are more positive towards other people, well, maybe that's a good thing to conform to that group. All right, let's see if our video on Milgram's study will work, because it's really interesting to watch the interactions and the emotions of the people who are doing the shocking. So essentially, well, I'll give kind of an overview. And so these participants, they came in and they were told that they were doing an experiment on learning. That there would be a teacher and a learner, and they wanted to see what punishment would do to learning, if people would learn better with punishment. So they were told that was part of the theory. Then the learner would go into a separate room. This learner was actually either an actor or, as you'll see, in some cases, a tape-recorded message responding to the teacher. So the teacher was the participant, the real person in the study was always picked as the teacher. And so they were a person asking the learner questions, and then if the learner answered them incorrectly, they would give them a shock, or they thought they were giving them a shock. So they had a machine, they were told it was generating a shock. They actually did get to feel a shock that it made in the beginning, so hopefully they believed, that it was shocking the people. Then the experimenter was there in the room, just instructing them what to do. And so as they went through, the learner or the recorded message, whether it was an actor or a recorded message, depends on the time they did it. The learner would start getting questions wrong. And so the teacher would be shocking at higher and higher voltage every time they got a new question wrong. In the end, the learner would just would start screaming in some cases, saying, "Let me out of here, I don't want to do this anymore," and then eventually just go silent. So silence when asking a question is essentially a wrong answer, so they would keep shocking. So a large percentage of people shocked all the way up to the highest level of shock on the shock generator. So the teachers, the participants in the study. Even when they would protest and say, "Hey, I want to stop this, I don't want to do this anymore," the experimenter, who was just sitting there in a room with a clipboard, a white lab coat, would say they would say things like, "The experiment requires that you continue. There's no permanent tissue damage. Please continue." There were like 4 or 5 phrases that they would say like that. They didn't try to coerce in other ways other than that. They didn't threaten the participant. They just said, "Hey, you're part of the study, you've got to keep going." They didn't have to keep going. They could have got up at any point, and some did. Some did just get up and leave, but a majority of them kept shocking what they thought was another human all the way up to the end. They were being obedient to the authority in the room. So I really want to watch the facial expressions of the people that think that they are shocking a person. They're not actually, but they don't know that. They were actually never told that after the experiment either. They didn't learn that they weren't actually shocking an actual human. Hey, it's working.
Being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. Nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front?
So, as a reminder here, this person here is an actor. They're in league with the researcher. So they're asking these questions as part of the actual methods of the study. So these were planned comments that this participant said. They did a lot of variations of this study over the years where the learner would say they had a condition or not mention anything at all. They would usually shock the teacher, the actual participant, with a very, very low voltage shock to show that, hey, this does actually shock you. But there were slight variations to see if those slight variations in the experiment changed the outcomes. But even with those kind of variations, they did tend to find that most people would shock all the way up to the furthest point on the shock generator.
Go to the shock generator, please, in the next room.
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is to teach the learner a simple word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts. Hard hit. Just how far can you go on this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
To complete the test.
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim.
Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most, subjects found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering. laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Who said I had heart trouble? My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, you know, when we say people went to the top of the shock board.
So with the audio level, it's probably hard to hear, but he says, he's saying something like, hey, should I go on? And the experimenter says, yes, please go on. He says, well, you're responsible for it. So with that, he's got this cognitive dissonance, but he's saying, well, someone else is responsible. It's not me that's responsible. I'm just following orders here. And so it continues on with what he thinks is shocking another human being at a level that the human being supposedly is saying that they're in pain, that it's hurting them, and so you can clearly see from these people and their reaction, they don't want to be shocking this person. This isn't something that they're enjoying doing. They're so stressed out, they're laughing hysterically. And then some people did, like that first example, stop. They wouldn't go on, they refused to, some left the room. So, but most did continue to shock all the way to the end of the experiment. I think that's the last example shown of an actual person doing it. Oh, here's another one later. Let's watch that, and then we'll talk about it.
What happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think, very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau, that you could staff a death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram?
So it's interesting to see so many different reactions, but so many of the participants in many times that they did this study did go and shock all the way. Now, there were definitely ethical problems with this study. One, that they didn't ever tell these participants after the study. They didn't do a debriefing. They didn't say, hey, you didn't actually shock a person. This was a tape recorder. All the hundreds of times, literally hundreds of times they ran this study, they didn't tell participants that. So that is one of the reasons we have now rules about debriefing participants, rules about lying to participants. Like they said in the beginning of the video, a lot of the early years of social psychology, there was kind of a bunch of social psychologists who kind of wanted to be famous social psychologists. They wanted to do the most extreme study, who can lie the most, who can get people to do the craziest things, which isn't a great way to go about studying a topic. But even so, we did get some good studies that taught us some really interesting things. This is one example of those, that we see that, like they mentioned there, you wouldn't have to staff the Nazi death camp with psychopaths. You just have a person in authority telling all the underlings to do certain unethical behaviors, and that's enough. You don't need everybody to be terrible people. Most of these were just average, everyday people from day-to-day life. When psychologists predicted before the study about how many people would shock to the end, they said, well, maybe like 1%, maybe 0.5% of the population will shock all the way to the end, because that's about, at that time, what they termed at that point psychopaths, like how many in the population there were. Problematic terms, new terms now, but at the time, that's what they thought. There would be about 0.5% of the population who would shock people all the way to the end. And what they found was it was about 2/3 of people in whatever kind of population they got. So the first populations that were tested were college-age students in the, well, white specifically, white male college-age students in the New Haven area, Northeast United States. Then later on, other researchers would say, hey, well, women won't do that. So they tested female college students. Same result, about 63%. So about 2/3 of them shocked all the way to the end. You won't see that same result in people who are higher SES or lower SES, or who are this ethnicity or this ethnicity. And no matter what groups that they tested, they found this consistent result that about 63% of people will shock all the way into the end and be obedient to that authority. So honestly, they probably didn't need to test it that many times, but Milgram was really excited about his method. He was getting very popular from it because of this really dramatic result that we see. And it is a relevant result. We see that people will be obedient to one other individual and follow those directions, even if it goes against their own ethics. So relevant to lots of things. So with this, in this specific situation, people didn't really know how they should or could respond in this situation. So when you're doing a study now, it's really important to say, well, hey, you can stop the study at any time. Participants weren't told that specifically. They weren't aware that they could leave. They thought that they had to stay there. There wasn't anybody actually like forcing them to be there. The experimenter was just in the room saying, hey, you must continue, but they didn't have to actually continue. So now we have to be a lot more explicit, saying you can stop the study at any time. Even when I run a survey online, because I say, hey, you can stop this at any time. It's not going to affect like you negatively in any way. We're not going to, our school, Salt Lake Community College, isn't going to deny you admittance in the future because you stopped your survey halfway through. Also, the normative information that they were getting suggested how they should behave. So the way the actor was acting, the way the experimenter was acting at telling them to keep going, suggested how they should be behaving. So they were conforming to that as well. So that was that social norm in that situation. And there was also this opportunity to deny responsibility. They said, hey, it's the experimenter's fault. It's not my fault. I was just following orders. As we know from things like the Nuremberg trials, that response isn't a valid legal defense, right? So the teachers still had the opportunity. Obviously, they weren't actually shocking people. So that's good. That's like the one ethical part of this study, is that they weren't actually shocking this person. But we did see a lot of that denial of responsibility, which isn't a good excuse. Also, in this kind of case, there was limited time to think about what to do. So the experimenter says, hey, keep shocking them, and you're there in that situation, you've got to make a decision right then. So this is similar to some things that whistleblowers experience. So whether it's a whistleblower in a company or the government, they often have a lot more time to think about their decision. So a whistleblower will often spend months or even years mulling over possible options of what to do about the ethics that they see being violated. So oftentimes whistleblowers will go through some of the proper channels, the channels that are set up for reporting, for example. They will try that. And then after they go to, say, HR, and HR tells them, well, don't worry about it, then they'll kind of escalate their behavior, or they might not. So there's a lot of people who do just stop there and don't continue on. But the whistleblowers, they generally do have more time to think about the decision with more knowledge about whistleblowing. So a lot of current whistleblowers are making it a point to share like how they went about it, how they went about making their decision, so they can put out into the world, whether it be just like on a Reddit post or a blog post or a YouTube video or a book, to let people know how they can respond. That when they're in the financial sector and they see embezzling from their higher ups, this is something that they can do. These are behaviors they can take. So these social psych experiments taught us a lot about that, but also apply to how we can change people's behaviors today. So if there's someone who wants to blow the whistle on something unethical, there's now more knowledge that, well, this is how people tend to behave, like this experiment. When their higher ups tell them to drop it, they tend to be obedient. But if they know that they have more time, that they have more resources, they might behave differently. So while we learned kind of this negative aspect of human behavior, we can now work around that or work with that and kind of hack human behavior to lead to better outcomes. Yep. With that, there is still, with whistleblowing, it's generally a novel experience. There was one whistleblower I was interviewing a couple months ago that they actually saw the same problem behavior in, I forget if it was 2 or 3 financial institutions. So they had whistleblown in the first financial institution they were working in, and they lost their job. They were out of a job for a couple of years. They got hired on by another financial institution that appeared to be more ethical. Couple of years later, they started seeing that exact same behavior or a very similar behavior at that specific institution. And so at that point, they knew who to contact in the government. This was in the UK, I believe. And then it happened even another time. It really made me, most whistleblowers don't get hired on in the same sector. And this tends to be why, because they are blacklisted, because they don't want their unethical behaviors being brought to light. So I do think it's a very strange example that it wasn't novel for that one whistleblower, but for most that we've studied, it's a novel experience. It's the first time they've seen something like this. So another study on group influence that we won't watch videos on. There's actually, I believe it's a Netflix documentary on the Stanford Prison study, and I think there's also a recent fictional, like partially true, partially fictional movie for entertainment based on the Stanford Prison study. So you might have heard it called Stanford Prison Experiment. So with this study, Phil Zimbardo took a bunch of Stanford students and put half of them as guards of a prison, half of them as the prisoners in the prison. The guards were told that they had complete authority, that they had to keep control of the prisoners, and what we saw was a lot of de-individualization, so reducing the people's identity to just a prisoner 525 or something like that. And then all the guards would do things like wear aviator sunglasses. They all wore the same uniform. And what we saw pretty quickly in that study was that this kind of de-individualization and this group pressure led to a lot of really abusive behaviors by the guards. More recent research and looking at the original journals, like literally written by people that were part of the study, shows that there were definitely a lot of methodological problems with this study. So it's not seen so much anymore as a useful methodological study, but it does show us a lot of unethical research methods. And it did start off a lot of the research in some of these problems. So we got some good things out of a bad study, essentially. So a lot of these guards acted uninhibited because they believed that nobody could identify them. Like the prisoners, they didn't know the actual names of the other students. They were just other students at Stanford, but they didn't know each other. So the Stanford prison guards, they wore large glasses, they took other names, they de-individualized themselves, they kind of blended into the group of guards. So we see that with other groups as well. So one example is the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of their behavior de-individualizes. So they're all one group, even though they might know each other just in day-to-day life. When they have their uniform on there, they appear different. They appear as a group. So social contagion is another thing learned from some of these social psych experiments and studied more recently as well. So this is when we imitate behavior. So emotions, ideas, things like social fads. So one example might be a particular dog breed becomes more popular. So a lot of members of a group or people that you see on TV might have that specific dog. So that idea of this dog is cool is contagious, for example. Social facilitation is also another thing groups can do. So some of these things that groups are doing can be really beneficial. Going back to earlier before, groups can be really useful for human survival. This is why we try to be in groups. So they can help us improve our performance. So for example, I think actually I have it here. No, I don't. Athletes at a high level, let's say Olympic athletes, for example, they perform better when they're around other competitors who are also about as good as them. So just a couple weeks ago, actually, my brother sent me some videos of the pole vault record being broken. So I pole vaulted in high school. Wasn't very good, honestly. It was fun, though. I had a lot of fun with it. But you'll see that these records get broken at world championships. And so while they might have gotten near that same height in, say, practice, usually for most athletes in most kind of areas, they perform, who are at a high level, they perform the best when they are in the presence of other people that are kind of at their level. So this goes into that topic of flow we mentioned earlier, but it's also because your arousal and your attention are high. So you're very conscious of that moment, you're in that moment, and this is called social facilitation. So you'll see a lot of records broken at Olympics, at World Championships, those kinds of things. You'll see teams play better in the playoffs than they would otherwise. It's not just because it's the end of the season, because they're all playing at a higher level, and that's kind of what the social group is kind of pushing them. So there's an aspect of it's not actually like some invisible energy of the group pushing them to do better, but you might feel it or experience it that way. You feel like there's a higher intensity or higher stakes. And so that pushes you, motivates you more internally to then behave. Also, there is social loafing, so exerting less effort when the group does things. So let's say everybody else in your working group for the group project is doing a lot of work. Well, you might loaf. So that's another social behavior. It lowers your own personal responsibility as well. So when it's something like, oh, well, the other guards at the Stanford Prison Study, the other guards were doing these unethical things, but I wasn't. So you're lowering your own personal responsibility. You can see social loafing too in like group dynamics in classes as well. Groupthink is another part of this, of group influence. So groupthink is defined as the impaired group decision making, because the right decision or changing your perspective or changing your attitude, changing your ideas becomes less important than keeping the group harmonized. So you might do this because, one, at an individual level, you might overestimate the power of your group or the morality of your group. You might think your group tends to be right. You might be closed-minded and unwilling to hear other sides. So this is kind of one of those downward spirals. Groupthink can be caused by closed-mindedness, but as groupthink develops, it also leads a group to be more closed-minded and unwilling to hear other sides. So it's kind of a downward spiral there, things working on each other. So you can stop groupthink through a couple different ways. A lot of research has been done to see, well, how can we stop a group from doing groupthink? And this can apply to something like an unethical group of guards in an experiment. This can apply to an unethical group, a gang, for example, that's doing illegal behaviors or something like that. This can also apply to the groupthink around a working group at work. You might be in groupthink and not like trying to hurt people, but maybe you're all making poor decisions about the product that you're releasing or your programming decisions, things like that. So groupthink can apply in a lot of different ways. To stop groupthink, one big thing is to not isolate yourself. Allow other sides of the arguments to be presented to you, you individually and you as the group. So your group at work allows, say, the other team that's like, hey, you should think about these kind of ideas or these ways to solve this problem. Listen or allow those messages to be heard. Having an impartial leader. So this can be hard because oftentimes because of the power of an authority. So if there is a leader of the group, they might be a big cause of the group think. But if you have an impartial leader that isn't as invested and doesn't cause this group think, so it's not like, so if your leader is leader over multiple groups, maybe that in a workspace environment, that might be a better way to do that. Including experts in on that debate. So if you're trying to make a decision in the workplace, bring in another person outside that knows about the topic you're working on, seeing if you can make a better decision. And then encouraging disagreement within the group. So encouraging people to bring up alternative ideas. So that can be hard when you're getting into this groupthink process. So the group kind of goes in that downward spiral and doesn't want to let disagreement with the group come up, but that can be an important thing. So this is all really related to prejudice and improving intergroup relations. So prejudice, the definition here, is an unjustified negative or positive attitude towards an individual based on their membership in a group. So this is very similar and related to things like stereotype that we talked about at the beginning of class. So the prejudice is this negative or positive attitude towards a group because of their membership in that group, not because of individual characteristics like of that individual person, but you have a negative or positive attitude towards them because they're in a group. So this is usually directed at things like race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, sexual orientation, age, religion, or SES. So essentially any group could have prejudiced attitudes thrown towards it or around it. So what are the causes of this? One of the causes is competition between different groups. So when resources are scarce, it seems that groups do tend to have intergroup, outgroup relations, say, hey, you're part of my group, that they're part of another group. And so especially when competing for scarce resources, this can develop. I thought I had a video here about the Rattlers and Eagles. Yeah, I want to watch that before I go into more detail on these. So let's watch this experiment, because this is really relevant, especially to ideas and current studies on prejudice, discrimination, and racism specifically. So as it hopefully loads up, the basics of this study are that I think this was also in the New England area as well, a bunch of young people, I forget what age they were, like around like 9 or maybe 12-year-old boys were taken to like a summer camp essentially. And so there were 2 camps that were near each other and were basically run by psychologists. So the 2 camps had the kids that came from basically the same population, the same area of the world. They were all the same religion. They were about the same age. They were all boys. So they had a lot of similarities, a lot more similarities than most groups, right? And so they put these kids in these groups. And what they found was that within these groups, they started to see stereotypes, prejudiced attitudes, discriminatory behaviors against the other groups. So the psychologists had certain theories that they were testing. Hey, is this why people do become prejudiced or do discriminatory behaviors? And then towards the last half of this camp, they did things to help alleviate those prejudiced attitudes, those discriminatory behaviors. So it's really relevant. I don't know why this is not working. This is so frustrating to me. Give me just a second to get this to work. Maybe I'll just have to restart my Firefox. Aha, I got it to work. So let's watch this Robbers Cave study and see what happened with these young kids. So again, the main point here is, and one of the really interesting things about the study is that these kids were similar in so many ways. So in most ways, these people were similar. So very few ways that they might on their own separate themselves into groups. So one is well, they did separate themselves into groups. How did that happen? And then once they separated and they had that in-group, out-group, what led to things like the prejudice and discriminatory behaviors? And then how did the researchers overcome those things? And how is that relevant to today and group dynamics that exist in our world?
Between 1949 and 1954, social psychologist Musafar Sherif and Carolyn Wood Sherif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sherif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sherif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sherif believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together.
So I just want to make sure it's clear here. Basically, all of these interactions between these kids have been created or manipulated by the researchers. So at first, there's these two camps that were close enough to each other, but they were kept apart. They didn't go past each other or didn't see each other. They were like far enough distance away that they didn't interact naturally. So then the researchers had competitive games. They did things like baseball and whatnot. So they put them together to see what would happen. They assumed what would happen, that based on theory. So again, the theories that explained social behavior would predict that because of having that limited resources, few pocket knives, so not everybody can get a pocket knife. Having those few resources would cause conflict. So realistic conflict theory, that was the framework they were hypothesizing off of. And then Sherif, like it was saying, said, well, then you can take these, then we started to see discriminatory behaviors. The raiding of the places, the fighting as well, the burning of flags. So we see similar things in racial tensions, people that do discriminatory behaviors towards specific ethnicities or races. So then what they did is not just put the kids together in the same camp doing the same things. Sheriff thought that, well, that won't be enough. And further research since then has shown that to be the case, that just contact with someone from the out group can reduce some of that friction. You might see similarities with that person. It might reduce your prejudices or those stereotypes or even those future person perceptions of people. But what works best is actually this, that working together for the same kind of goals. So the researchers made a situation where the water tank stopped working. They made a situation where the truck stopped moving and it had to get pulled by both groups. It couldn't be pulled by just one. So by very carefully manipulating the situations so that the groups had to work together for important things, like the truck bringing food to both camps or the water tank that fed both camps water. So working together for these showed and has shown in research since then that that is one of the best ways to get this in-group, out-group behavior to go away, to get rid of those kinds of discriminatory behaviors, to get rid of prejudiced attitudes, to get rid of that future person perception. Like if they saw, in going back to person perception, one of the first things that we learned about today, if the Rattlers saw another person that looked like they were on the Eagles, they might have that perception that they were sissies, like you could probably see with their writings of how they describe the other group. So these are some of the best ways that we found to reduce that kind of discriminatory behavior, prejudiced attitudes, and improve those intergroup relations, breaking down that in-group, out-group wall.
At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Mustafar and Carolyn Sheriff had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
So more recent research has built on these ideas. So we've known a lot of these facts about in-group, out-group relations. More recent research has done, well, a couple things, has gone more in depth and see, well, how does this apply to, say, doctors versus nurses that aren't getting along well as two separate groups? How does this relate to two different teams at work that are fighting each other? So there's that industrial organizational psychology bent to it. There's also been a lot of applied work. How do we get into communities and help groups that are kind of opposing each other work together for common goals, that kind of thing. So we've built, since then, social psychology has done a good job of using these basic facts from these kinds of studies and building on them, diving more in depth, seeing what else it applies to, bringing in other disciplines, that's the word I'm looking for, bringing in other relevant disciplines like sociology, finding what they know, and also now doing a lot of applied work. So both developmental psychology and social psychology have a very applied psychology and applied science aim to it in that. And what I mean by that is that they are working to fix maybe problems that are seen, using this knowledge to try and then intervene in actual human life and behavior to help people thrive. So we've taken this, gone more in depth, and are now using it to try and even solve problems in the world. So going back in the slides, things we saw in that specific example with the Rattlers and Eagles, that the competition between these groups is one reason some of these prejudiced attitudes came about. So this in-group bias, thinking your group was good, your group was better, your group was strong, the other group was not, led to that some of that in-group, out-group behavior. I think I might hear a cat getting into food. Just a second, sorry. It wasn't a cat, it was my child. So no problem. The cat is not going to throw up all over the house because of eating fishy crackers. Sorry for the distraction. That happens sometimes when working from home. I'm sure many of you have had similar things. Maybe it's not a child, maybe it's a dog, maybe it is a child. Anyway, also one other thing that tends to lead to more prejudiced attitudes is having parents and grandparents with prejudice as well. So even if that's the way these prejudices have developed, as having parents and grandparents and like on and on back in the past, we've seen now that putting groups together for common goals can lead to diminishing and deletion of those prejudices. So these stereotypes, these prejudices, well, the stereotypes themselves, that person perception and these stereotyped attitudes, they are cognitive shortcuts. They can be useful in one-on-one interactions with people. They can help us use less mental energy to get things done, like getting to the store and getting what we need. But they can lead to a lot of errors. It can lead to things like prejudice. It can lead to things like discrimination. So discrimination is defined as an unjustified negative or harmful action towards a person because they're a member of the group. So an action towards the eagles because they're a member of that group of eagles. So groups in general can give us a sense of identity. They can help us gain that knowledge that we might not have, right? So the group might know something that we don't. They can improve our self-esteem. Humans want to be part of groups. However, they can lead to negative views of other people, other groups, dehumanization. So seeing another group of college students as just prisoners and something less than human, leading to seeing other people in the world as less than human. It's not a good thing. So how can we use these studies to then decrease the negative effects of groups, but increase the positive effects of groups? And so a lot of what we've focused on has been the negative effects of groups. I have mentioned some of the positive effects of groups, like that groups can give you more knowledge than you have. It's essential for survival, those kinds of things. But this is also how a lot of social psychology over the course of time has focused. The initial start was focusing on the negative. What do groups do that is bad? And later on, there was more research, and even still, there's still more of a focus on what bad things do groups do. But over time, more research has been done on, well, what are good things that groups can accomplish together? And then how can we basically hack human behavior, human group behavior, to increase this positive? How can we do just those positive aspects of groups and not do these negative aspects of groups? So the Rattlers and Eagles is a really good example of what we can do. The simple contact can be helpful. So sitting next to, having your cubicle next to someone from the other team on work, that simple contact can be effective, especially when that person's considered to be the same status as you. So if the person's sitting next to you in the cubicle, if they have like your same job title, if they're getting paid like the same as you, versus if they're lower on the hierarchy, that simple contact is not going to be as effective at removing these prejudice attitudes. So how do we get rid of these things? As these are developing, most of these prejudices and discrimination, it becomes really automatic. Just like those person perceptions, these prejudice attitudes, they become automatic in a person. So how to get rid of that? So, I mean, we've kind of just been talking about it with the Rattlers and Eagles. So we'll just go through. So one thing is so if you have an individual who, say, comes into therapy or who wants to change their attitudes, who has had some of that cognitive dissonance, maybe they've seen, oh, members of that group aren't all that way or something like that. How can they get rid of some of these attitudes? One is recognizing that they have stereotyped attitudes or impressions, recognizing that you have any kind of stereotype attitudes or impressions about a person because of their group membership. Then training new habits. So we've talked about the neurology of our basic actions, like our general habits have neural networks that are very often firing. Even when we're asleep, they're firing those same kind of neural networks. That's why most of our dreams, for example, are in a normal space like our own home, our workplace, those kinds of things. last night, or like a couple nights ago, I had kind of a strange dream, but it was still set in my own house. My daughter was like asking for soup and wanted to put like soup on her head or something like that in the dream, which that part is weird, but not super far out of the norm for a child. So main point there is these default neural networks are consistently firing, so it's hard to train those habits because of the neurology that we have. So our neurology is kind of having us go with, say, these automatic perceptions of people, these prejudiced ideas. So train new habits, specifically use energy to think of people in the out group who do not fit the stereotype. So if you have a stereotype of the Eagles, you could specifically think of a person in that group who doesn't fit the stereotype. If you thought everybody in that group of Eagles was sissies, then you could say, oh wait, I saw Jay, he did this, that wasn't a sissy thing to do. So thinking specifically about that, and that's something that you have to use cognitive energy, you have to experience that cognitive dissonance, and that's a hard thing to do. So seeking out contact with members of that group. So in the Rattlers-Eagles study, the researchers themselves put the people together. But as someone who might want to get rid of prejudice or discriminatory prejudice attitudes yourself, that you would yourself go and seek out contact with members of that group. You might be put in contact with members of that group in, say, the workplace or just day-to-day life, but intentionally seeking out contact will help you see individuals that don't fit the stereotypes that you might hold, and then recognize also some of those stereotype thoughts or impressions. So the main point here is that these social pressures, these social forces of social psychology, of groups, of obedience to authority, dehumanization, de-individualization, that person perception, are cognitive shortcuts that then lead to things like prejudice. They can be used in good ways instead of to harm people. So that's one of the main points here. And that's one of the main areas that actually started off research into heroism, which is where I came into social psychology and then developmental psychology, to see that, well, people can also do a lot of good. Groups themselves can do a lot of good. Groups can provide us with a lot of utility and support and help. So using those kind of natural group pressures essentially can be used in these more positive ways. So this leads us to think about things like altruism and pro-social behavior. And I've used this method, this kind of example a couple times today, helping someone on the side of the street, the whistleblowers, doing something pro-social at risk to themselves. But this can be used in other ways too. So looking, I think I showed this at the very first, it's either the very first or second class meeting that we ever had. When you see a socially significant problem, whether it be racism, for example, you can look at this research in social psychology. You can look at the theories that exist there, the realistic conflict theory, like we saw there. You can get out in the real world in a camp, for example. You can collaborate with communities, practitioners, people that are already working on solving that problem. So maybe there's already people working on solving problems of discrimination. You can use good research methods, so using good experimental or observational methods. And then, based on what you find, let people know your findings. So if it's going to be relevant to teachers, write it in a way that's going to be able to be read by teachers. It's going to be only useful to psychologists reading scientific journals, then that's probably where you should publish that work. If it should be out in a YouTube video, put it out in a YouTube video. And the idea here is that by evaluating and trying and applying research to real world problems, we could actually solve problems. So this is why I'm an applied psychologist. I try to use things like the basic research, like theories, to try and suggest, well, if we do this, we can maybe change the way this group is behaving or the way these individuals develop in a way that they can be more pro-social and more positive. And then hopefully, eventually, the problems get solved. So with that, I think that's a good point to stop on. Yeah, these are just extra slides here. These are not for specifically social psychology. So I think that's a good place to stop for social psychology. We are a little bit early today, so why don't we take a quick look at the study guide, and I'll stop the recording now as well. So essentially anyone who's still here and around and they'll get to get something out of sticking around for so long. Maybe I'll even give a couple answers to the exam itself. So as a reminder, the exam is opening up essentially right after midnight tonight, and then we'll close Saturday just before midnight. So make sure you find and plan a time where you can take it. It's 90 minutes. We counted at the beginning of class 61 questions, if I remember right. So you'll have open books, open notes. I do recommend rewriting some parts of your notes that you know you're struggling with. Like if it's hard for you to remember what we just covered on social psychology, definitely put that on a note card. If it's hard for you to remember some of the things we talked about in relation to consciousness, hypnotism versus what's happening with dreams versus what's happening with drugs versus what's happening with meditation, write those things down. So it's a quicker reference, especially on something that you're not remembering well. If you remember it well, you probably don't have to rewrite that note because you're probably going to remember it for the exam. All right, so let's open up the study guide. I'm going to turn off the recording, and anyone who is here can work with us to answer some of these questions on the study guide. And then at the end of this, I'll actually give a couple answers to the exam.